I didn't want to talk to anyone, and I could hardly function enough to even do the routine, basic tasks.
Yeah.
All I wanted to do is pull the covers over my head and just make life stop. It felt cruel and unfair for others to expect life to go on when my very breath had been harshly knocked out of me. And I felt like I was left gasping for air.
Welcome back to our series From Pain to Purpose, where we seek to ignite your faith, hope, and purpose in living as an overcomer. Since last time, we've been getting many messages and emails from many who are going through very difficult situations, from life-threatening accidents to relational struggles and addictions. Even though we aren't able to personally respond to each one of you, we read your messages, and it's inspiring to see the hope God has birthed in your hearts.
Yeah, absolutely. From all the people we've been hearing from, all of the situations we've heard, there's one thing that remains the same in each of the stories. And that's when we experience a deep pain or loss, it completely blindsides us. We never expect these things to happen to us.
It's always somebody else.
Yeah, exactly. Part of the difficulty is the shock of everything. Like, no one expects to hear the word cancer. You don't expect your spouse's betrayal or to get caught up in addiction. You, as my parents, never expected to hear that 2 of your children would need heart transplants, or that your son had cancer, or, that he was in heart failure for the 2nd time. Alicia and I never expected for our brother to die. And so when things like that happen, it's like we're plunged into this freezing cold water without warning and without swimming lessons, and we have absolutely no idea where to turn or how to even begin to save ourselves.
That's right.
And when we enter into relationship with Jesus, it's like we're going into a battlefield. There's a battle intensity that goes on around our lives. It's like if you'd never seen a football game, now I would say, would you like to go into this stadium, with the bleachers full of people, run from one end 100 yards, get the ball, run to the other end. When you cross the finish line, people are going to yell, cheer, be excited for what you've done, what you've accomplished, and you'd say, yes, I like that. So you get in, they hike the ball to you, you start running. You know what happens? You're going to get tackled. You're going to get knocked down. They're going to sit on top of you. And you get up and you look at me and you say, there's mean men out there. They tackled me. They knocked me down. They were mean. And I'd say, oh, there's one other aspect to this game. There's an opposing team. There's an enemy. And when you get that ball, you are the target. And so when we receive Jesus in our life and we begin living that life, there's an enemy. And his goal, purpose, tactic is to take you down, destroy you. We are overcomers when we continue to surrender and trust Jesus in greater levels in our lives.
Yeah.
That's right.
Okay, so let's dive into the topic of grief. Grief is, the actual result of pain. And it's something that's not often understood. It's not a very compelling word, so we may not think it applies to us. You can be grieving and not know you are grieving. The dictionary definition of grief is actually a really poor one, but it says that grief is deep sorrow, especially caused by someone's death. And the definition of sorrow is a feeling of deep distress. So essentially, it's saying grief is the feeling of deep distress, especially caused by someone's death. Now, while this definition touches one of the aspects of grief, it's actually much more than that. Grief is the deep distress we feel when we experience a loss. And this could be the loss of a relationship due to the death of a loved one, but it could also be the loss of relationship due to divorce or estrangement. You may find yourself grieving the loss of health, loss of financial accomplishment or stability, or even the loss of dreams. So even if you haven't faced a death, keep in mind that you may actually be grieving. And so that's some of what we're going to talk about here.
So that's true. And let's talk about some of the symptoms of grief. This is to help you recognize that if you or someone you know are in a state of grief, it's important that you identify and you understand why you're feeling the emotions that you're struggling with. One symptom of grief is feeling like you're suffocating. I remember right after Austin's death that I literally felt like I was suffocating in the ocean of grief. I didn't want to talk to anyone, and I could hardly function enough to even do the routine, basic tasks.
Yeah.
All I wanted to do is pull the covers over my head and just make life stop. It felt cruel and unfair for others to expect life to go on when my very breath had been harshly knocked out of me. And I felt like I was left gasping for air. Brain fog and unstable emotions are also common symptoms of grief. For this very reason, it's wise to not make drastic decisions for at least the first year after you faced a major loss. Insomnia, depression, fatigue can also be part of the journey of grief. I had never realized before just how physically draining it was and the hard work involved in the grieving process. Being short-tempered can also be a symptom of grief. So make sure to be able to identify what you're actually struggling with. Anger at God and others are often prevalent during intense grieving. And as we can see in the story of the Garden of Eden, blaming others for our pain and loss is just a natural response of fallen humanity. But I believe Satan wants us to focus our blame on everyone else except on the one who's really responsible, and that's himself. Although there are more symptoms of grief than what we can list here, I just want to mention the very unhealthy symptom of the one called denial.
That's a big one.
Self-protecting response, it's understandable, but it's very dangerous. We've personally walked with individuals who have been negatively impacted by denial because they weren't given the opportunity to truly grieve. In fact, I remember one lady that told me just a few short months after Austin passed away that it was time to stop our tears and it was time to quit grieving. I remember it really shocked me, but she told me how she lost her mom when she was just a little girl. And I believe it was the day after her mom's funeral when her dad came down and he talked to the children there sitting at the table. And he told the family that they're never allowed to cry for their mom again. Wow. So she was forced to immediately move on. Wow. And this it prevented her from being vulnerable and connecting deeply with others over the years. It was not... She was just maybe, 7 or 8 years old. But she was not given permission to grieve. And that greatly impacted her for the rest of her life.
In my life, I've not only experienced the loss of my brother, but also the loss of my health. And actually many of the symptoms of the loss of a person also apply to the loss of health. Some of these symptoms that I've experienced with my health loss include feelings of self-hatred and aloneness. I feel self-hatred because I want to fix the problem and just make all the pain go away, but I can't. And when I see my physical body as being the problem, it's just a downward spiral. I've also struggled with the feeling of aloneness. And if you're watching this and you feel like you're the only one who is struggling with the physical loss, please let me assure you that you are not. This is a common belief, but so untrue and destructive. When we feel like no one can relate or understand what we're going through, we won't share our burdens with fellow believers. But it's especially in the time of loss that it's so incredibly important to have support.
It's true.
Yeah. So next we're going to look into the common myths of grief. So whether you are personally experiencing grief or know someone else who is, breaking down these myths will help in moving forward. First, let's address the myths if you're walking with someone who is grieving. So Alicia, you had some thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I think myth number 1 is that you know exactly what someone's going through if you've walked a similar journey. Not long after my brother died, a lady told us she knew exactly what we were going through because her pet had recently died. While pets dying is a loss, it wasn't exactly what we needed to hear at that time. The truth is, each person's journey is different, and they will experience grief differently.
True. So myth number 2 is that I need to have something profound to say to someone who's grieving. People usually don't need the objective truth in the shock of grief. they're suffering from a broken heart and not a broken head. Too many times we try to talk to that broken head instead of caring for their hearts. During my intense grief, I didn't really need the pep talks or even people quoting scripture verses to me as much as I needed to hear that I was not alone and that others truly cared about my grief.
Because we knew those things.
We did.
Had that head knowledge.
We did.
So.
I needed to hear that they were hurting with me. You know, if you look at the response when Lazarus died, you see Jesus weeping with Martha and Mary. And I've often wondered, you know, why did he do this if he knew that he had the ability to raise Lazarus from the dead?
Right.
Why did he weep with them? Jesus knew that speaking into someone's aloneness is the most compassionate thing that we can do. In fact, the Bible clearly talks about the first crisis in the Bible is just that. It's aloneness.
So you're saying that he entered into the aloneness with
Mary and Martha.
By identifying with
Yes.
their grief.
Rather than saying, you know, I'm going to raise him or he's in eternity with God. He spoke into their aloneness. If you know of someone who's grieving, it's important to extend more grace and have fewer expectations of them. Do what you can to relieve them of responsibilities. You know, and someday you will likely experience grief, and then you'll more fully understand the importance of this. I know so often if we've never walked the journey, it's hard for us to know what to say or what to do. But it's very important that just speaking into somebody's aloneness and caring for their hearts.
So although the following statements may be true, during the shock of grief, it's not the time to say things like, I know what you're going through. God works all things together for good. Or God has a plan for your life.
It's true.
But things that you can say would be like, I'm so sorry for what you are going through. My heart breaks for you. I'm here to help you. Let me know what I can do for you. Or if you just need to talk.
Or sometimes just practical ways of showing, like taking a meal and offering to come clean their house or babysit the children or something like that is
that speaking into, it's speaking to their heart.
Entering into.
And not
Right.
just to their head.
Right.
Most people feel alone in their grief. And removing that aloneness by listening and entering into and seeing through their eyes, maybe even crying with them, will
Means a lot.
remove that aloneness.
So what are some of the myths if you are the one who is grieving? And that brings us to myth number 3, which is that sadness is the only thing you feel during grief. The truth is your emotions will be like a roller coaster.
You feel many emotions at the same time.
Yeah, one minute you may be deeply sad. The next you may feel like very angry. And then the anger melts into numbness, which then gives way to joy, which turns into sorrow. The point is there's going to be many emotions you can feel at the same time. I needed to learn to be okay with the process and to trust that my emotions wouldn't always be this volatile.
Yes, and that takes us to myth number 4, which is that Jesus doesn't really care about our grief. You know, it feels that he feels far away, and maybe it feels like he's forsaken you. But you know, in Psalms 34:18, it says that the Lord is close to the brokenhearted. And that's a promise. God has promised that he is close to the brokenhearted. So if God seems far away, it may be because of a lie that we're believing. Or in Psalms, I'm trying to think what the other verse is, Psalm 66:18, it says, if I regard iniquity in my heart, the Lord will not hear me. So maybe it's because that you have anger towards God, or maybe there's an unconfessed sin in your life that is keeping you from experiencing that sweet fellowship with the Lord. But Jesus does care about our grief, and he truly desires to carry you during the hardest trial that you will ever face. You know, I'll never forget the one time when Jesus so clearly revealed this truth to me. It was during a very dark and just intensely difficult season in our lives as a family. I remember it was during the time that Austin was battling cancer. Alicia had this horrible skin condition. And I just remember I was alone that evening in our minivan, and my tears were streaming. I was crying. I felt like I was at the point of breaking. And so in desperation, I just remember crying out to God and just saying, God, please show me that you are near, that you understand what we're going through. You know, I'll never forget what happened, because I felt the presence of God come into our van like I've never felt before. And I didn't hear an audible voice, but I clearly heard God speaking into my heart, just at the same time that I felt this presence, this warm presence. All I heard was Joel 2:25. And I just knew in my heart, I knew it was a voice of God. I had no idea what that verse was about. I was not familiar with the verse at the time. But I remember I eagerly went home and I opened my Bible to Joel 2:25. And you know, this verse ended up being such a huge source of encouragement to me during that intense time. I'll never forget the presence of God that I felt. And the verse, if you're not familiar with it, it talks about God restoring the years that the locusts have eaten. And though I know, you know, it was a long time till God truly restored those years, and I also know that ultimately it will never be totally restored to us until we get to heaven.
Mm-hmm. And that's really neat. That's cool.
Myth number 5. If I bury my grief, I can move on. A friend of mine preached his son's funeral. I don't know how you can do that, except that he was sharing from his head, his intellect, rather than from his heart. Not processing it from a heart level. 3 years later, he was experiencing deep anger because he tried to bury his grief. You need to face and process the loss. If you bury the grief, if you try to bury it, it's going to come out in an unhealthy and destructive way.
That's right.
Feeling our emotions is important. What we do with our emotions is even more important.
That's right. And myth number 6 is that grieving has a deadline. You know, the truth is that everyone grieves differently. We learned that as a family. There's no perfect timeline or even specific protocol for grieving. How long is a healthy time to grieve is actually an inappropriate question to ask, because you will always grieve your loss. But with time, you know, the pain won't be as raw. Think about it like this. If my arm is cut off, I will always miss that arm. But with time, the wound will heal and I'll learn to adapt without it. Even though I'll never completely be the same. There's not a perfect formula for how grieving should look. There's really no time limit for grieving. But whenever you love deeply, you can be assured that you're going to grieve deeply. And everyone grieves differently.
Although I think my way of grieving is best, but you know.
What is considered to be a healing process, though, for one person might not be the same. It can be painful to the other person.
Yeah. So being sensitive is very important.
Being sensitive to each other and the different way of grieving is very important.
Yeah, to be sensitive to each other, to give time. I remember the ministry that we were serving with gave us time to grieve, time off. And about 6 months after Austin's passing, we had the opportunity to sing as a family, to minister, and I asked our girls to help us that evening and to participate, and one of them wasn't sure about that, and I said I didn't know what was an unhealthy, I'm not going to do this perspective, or what was a healthy grieving process. And so I said, I'd like you to help us at least sing one song tonight. And partway through that song, she broke down and began crying. And so as soon as we stepped off the stage, I gave her a hug and said, I'm sorry, it was a bit too soon to do that. And so timing is just different for everyone.
That's right.
And then not long after that, we did a 10-song album in memory of Austin, and she was glad to participate. That was a healthy part of her remembering Austin and remembering the past.
That daughter was me, by the way. I was the one that didn't want to like sing right at first.
It felt disloyal.
Yeah, but then after there was that context put on it where we did an album in memory of my brother, I wanted to participate in that then.
And I think, yeah, for you it was painful to do that, but for, some of us it was healing to be able to do it and to be able to share songs,
To be able to sing.
give hope,
You're
and
saying
to,
not...
right.
Because once we recorded that album, then it was,
Right.
that was healing for me
Right.
as well.
So, but that's where we just needed to be understanding and sensitive to each other.
Yep. Yep. Then I think of myth number 7 is the goal of grief is to get back to how things were before. You won't be the same person that you were before the event. There will be a new normal. And it's like, by God's grace, some things can be better than they were before. And some things are not as good. But in God's economy, He will extend grace and actually redeem those difficult, those ugly things. As Jerry Sitzer says in A Grace Disguised, he talks about how pain and loss enlarges our soul. I'll never be the same person I was prior to our son's 2 heart transplants and to 2 different battles with cancer, heart failure for Alicia. And, I can feel the pain of others because of my experience. I will listen differently. I will respond differently. I'm more sensitive. I make different decisions today because of my past. My soul has become enlarged, and I feel joy and sorrow at the same time.
It's good.
A game changer is when we recognize Jesus' presence in the midst of our suffering.
That's right.
A friend of mine had a great suggestion that has really helped me apply this practically. My friend had just come through a rough surgery, and she'd be in pain and awake a lot during the nights. She would picture Jesus sitting on a chair beside her bed and crying with her. This has been so helpful to me whenever I feel overwhelmed in my pain. Jesus really is going through this pain and loss with you. But so often the pain is a distraction, and we really miss experiencing His love in the midst of our pain.
I've done that, and experiencing Jesus being right there with me. You may be watching, and this, as you're watching, your life may be unstable. There may be unknowns. There may be ugly that is going on in your life right now. Take time to picture Jesus with me and talk to Jesus. Jesus was tempted. Jesus suffered. Isaiah talks about how He was despised and rejected, man of sorrow. He was acquainted with grief. Luke talks about how He came to His own, and His own received Him not. They pushed Him out. Picture Jesus sitting beside you now as He sees your situation. As you look into His face, you see His compassionate, His caring eyes. In fact, tears in His eyes as He deeply understands your life circumstances. Talk with Him.
He weeps with you.
Tell Him what's in your heart. Just something like, Jesus, you really do know what I'm going through. Jesus, you are here with me. Jesus, I trust you right now. I trust you with, and then tell Him the circumstances that are around your life. Tell Him what's going on. And say, Jesus, I'm trusting you with this. God, I'm trusting your goodness, your power, your love for me. Because God wants to walk with you through those difficult times.
Amen.
I've seen what would take years of counseling or years of post-traumatic stress disorder therapy to evaporate and disappear in moments as individuals have encountered the healer, as they've encountered Jesus. And the foundational aspect of healing from pain starts with a personal relationship with Jesus. And today, if you do not have a personal relationship with God, you cannot find that complete and true healing. A relationship with Jesus is first acknowledging, I have sinned. I've done wrong. Second, it's when we look into God's Word and we realize that Jesus died for us on the cross. Next, it's being willing to turn away from doing wrong, from sinning, which is repenting, where we turn away from sin and we turn to God. And then it's just coming to God in prayer and saying, Jesus, I believe that I'm a sinner. Jesus, I believe that you died on the cross for my sins. I repent. I turn away from sin and I turn to you, Jesus. If you're ready to begin this walk with Jesus, find someone you know who is a believer and talk with them. Talk more about it. It doesn't mean that you will no longer feel grief. Since there is an opposing team, there's the enemy. He will bring opposition into our lives. But it does empower you to live as an overcomer.
That is where the power comes from.
It is.
Yeah. So, what are some action steps that you can take away from this time? Give us our first one.
I think the first one would be to identify your grief. Maybe you realize that you're grieving right now, but maybe there's been things in the past that you realize that you're not done grieving that yet. Stuffing your emotions and not acknowledging your pain will come back to haunt you later on, as we shared. But grieving is raw, it's ugly, and it's messy, but it's vital, and it's oh so healing. It's the only way to healing.
The second thing would be taking intentional time to acknowledge what you're feeling. We can keep ourselves so entertained and distracted and preoccupied with everything else we can imagine when we don't want to deal with something. Yeah. There was an inmate at a prison where we were ministering at that told me one of the reasons that coming to prison actually helped her was because it removed all distractions from her life. She used to always have, noise around her, like driving in the car, she listened to music. There were so many to-do lists and day-to-day stressors that she didn't really look at the direction her life was taking her. Yeah, so grieving, it takes time. It takes focus, and it takes courage. So maybe take some time this week to turn off the distractions, get alone with your thoughts, and discover what you're truly feeling and why, even though that may be uncomfortable and scary.
And surrendering some of that, I think, is another important step of just taking that pain and saying, Jesus, I just surrender that to you, and invite Jesus to come into that painful area in your life. And maybe there's still healing that he still wants to do in your heart. So don't be afraid to invite Jesus into that broken area in your life.
We'll talk more about that next week too. Yes. You have our third one, Dad?
Then, let your guard down and share with someone who is safe. We need the family of God to grieve with us. As believers and as a church community, we need to listen. We need to walk with and grieve with those who have experienced losses. I've had private tears. I'm sitting there in my office at my desk, driving down the road. I've had family tears when we processed as a family, and extended family tears. In fact, last week, my brother walked across the parking lot and came over and gave me this big old hug. And I was trying to figure out what he was doing with it, but he said, today is Austin's birthday, right? And so he was grieving with me in that way. We've had public tears in the grief process. There have been many times in my life when I was feeling the extreme pain, but it wasn't the right place or with the right people to process my grief. And there were times that every fiber of my body was screaming out, God, this isn't fair. God, this hurts. But I blessed others by wearing a smile on my face. And later then, when I was by myself or with family or someone safe, I wept tremendously. When I live with expectation that others need to treat me differently because of the loss I've experienced, I'm becoming unhealthy.
That's right.
So there are appropriate times and places to find someone that you can share with.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very important.
It is.
to do. So today we've talked about how to identify grief, which is the very first step in the process. And in our next time together, we'll be talking about healthy ways to grieve and how to be an overcomer through our grief. So until then, you can watch The Journey on this channel, which is our family's life story if you haven't seen that, and explore the channel for other music video series and other content like that. Consider subscribing to get our new video content when it comes out, or you can also sign up for our emails where you get the content directly to your inbox with exclusive things that we'll be sharing there as well.
Thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you again next time. Until then, live as an overcomer and stay in the fight.